Trump's so-called border czar, really, he's a deportation czar. And there is no, let's be clear, there is no czar position. This is when you want somebody in that you feel that you cannot get past the Senate. It's unclear exactly what his role is. I mean, how is he being paid? What does it say on his payroll? I guess just sort of advisor. But here is Tom Homan. This is the guy who built out the child separation programs, the worst of the worst in terms of the border, despite the fact that some people think like, oh, well, only the bad immigrants, whatever that means, the ones who do crime are going to be rounded up. As of now, the incoming Trump administration really appears to be interested in deporting 11 million people. Remember, about 80% of these people have been in this country for more than 10 years. And it's going to be pretty ugly. Here is Tom Homan, the newly appointed deportation czar-elect, I guess.
You know, Tom, first of all, congratulations to you. And I'm so glad for the Border Patrol that morale is already being lifted. They have just been beaten down by the policies of this last administration. I'm really encouraged by what you're saying, because I think the toughest part of your job isn't the deportation. It's dealing with the propaganda from the other side saying that what you're doing is not compassionate, that it's not humanitarian. And what do you plan to do? I'm glad you mentioned the 300,000 children that are missing. But how are you going to deal with those kinds of attacks, even though you know that this open border has led to sex trafficking of children and an exponential increase of child labor, illegal child labor?
Frankly, I don't care what people think about me, especially on the left. Again, when you have a historic crisis, a crisis this big, here's what they need to know. When you have a crisis this big that overwhelms the Border Patrol, where the majority of Border Patrol are no longer on patrol, they're making sandwiches, they're changing diapers, they're making baby formula, they're making hospital runs, they're making airport runs. When you take most of the Border Patrol agents off the border to deal with humanitarian crisis, that's when the fentanyl comes across to kill 250,000 Americans. That's when the sex trafficking has increased 600%. That's when no suspected terrorists has crossed this country. They've had a record of people on terrorist watch list that have been arrested at the southern border. That's why you have over 2 million gotaways. How many of them came from a country sponsoring terror? So I don't care what anybody's opinion is on illegal immigration. When you create a crisis this big, all these other bad things happen. That's why we have to secure the border. I don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, or independent. So border security is national security. We should all be on the same side of that. I've been saying this for the last couple of years. And the director of the FBI actually agrees with me. I don't respect him greatly, but he agrees with me. The southwest border is the biggest national security vulnerability this nation's ever seen. He sees more red flags now than ever before. We have to secure the border. And as far as the people want to push back on deporting these people, what is the option? You have a right to claim asylum. You have a right to see a judge, and we make that happen. But at the end of that due process, if the judge says you must go home, then we have to take them home. Because if we're not, what the hell are we doing?
Pause it for a second. Now, their deportation plans, I don't know if he's backing off this, but the problem is that there's not enough judges to make these assessments. And no one's arguing that you shouldn't make these assessments. In terms of like the asylum thing, we can have I have a different idea about immigration broadly, but the deportation they're talking about is going to be extensive. And his response to like it not being compassionate, I don't care. We're going to deport. And it's going to be interesting to see if they do this. And it's going to be heartbreaking and tragic for a lot, millions upon millions of people, because these 11 million people, 80% of whom have been here for 10 years, they're not islands. They have friends. They have family. This is going to impact 10% of our country. I mean,
yeah.
Because if we're not, what the hell are we doing? If the judge's order doesn't mean anything, then shut down the immigration court, take the border patrol off the border, so there's no consequences violating the laws of this country. We'll give you a fair shake. You get a chance to claim asylum, but due process doesn't mean squat if the final decision of the court isn't carried out. What is the option? Let them all stay? Because if that's the option you want, you're never going to fix the southern border, because you send a message to the whole world. Come to the United States, enter the country legally, which is a crime. Don't show up in court, or show up in court, get an order removal, but you still get to stay. That doesn't work.
No. Okay. It's about being able to go through a court system while your asylum process is being process. It's about not, temporary protected. Well, I guess
they're going to roll back temporary protected status as well for
right.
That went through a process. That's a legal process. There's nothing illegal about those people in Springfield, Ohio, that were a fixture of the campaign demonizing immigrants this past few months.
But that's the point. Is that honestly, we need there is a brokenness in our immigration system in terms of processing and getting people's asylum claims heard adequately and quickly. But that's a problem for funding that process as opposed to just heavily militarizing the border. And it's crazy to hear that Fox host talk about child labor. You guys want child labor. Sarah Huckabee Sanders just, last year? Signed a law making it easier for her state to employ children. And you know who those children are? They're mostly undocumented kids.
Yeah, the reason
they're 14
why...
or but what that law did was it removed paperwork requirements to have parents sign off on their 14 or 15-year-old kids working in these meat facilities, which have killed children, by the way, because all these Republicans want these kids to be able to do all this work for very little money, but have the threat of deportation hanging over their heads. So all they're doing right now is giving bosses who want to use this against their undocumented labor force infinitely more leverage and
plausible
fear.
Deniability as well.
That too.
As long as I didn't, it's not, I got 15-year-old Honduran kids working here. I had no idea. I did all the requirements. They gave me a social security card. They said, and that was it. I didn't have to nobody sign off or anything like that. Didn't raise any red flags. Why would it? Perfectly legal to hire a 15-year-old for this meat processing plant or, farm labor or poultry producing factory. I mean, that's you can track all of these bills. The person who is introducing these bills in these state senates and state assemblies, almost one-to-one relationship between the person who introduces this bill and their locality will have some major food processing plant that hires a lot of undocumented immigrants. That's basically it.
Donald Trump himself exploited undocumented Polish labor to build Trump Tower, and then called immigration services on them when they started saying, hey, you aren't paying us even the undercutting wages that you promised us. The scary thing is the check is, the split is between capitalists like Trump, who exploit to this day on his Mar-a-Lago and stuff, undocumented labor, and then white supremacists who look at demographics and want those changed. And we have to hope the capitalists exploiting those people beat out the we want to get rid of the not brown people, and that's where we're at right now.
This is a good point because we saw this during the net neutrality battle. During the Obama years, there was Obama hired a Verizon lobbyist to be head of the FCC. Everybody thought net neutrality was cooked because of it. And there were two reasons why net neutrality went through, at least during the Obama administration. As an administrative change. One was because there were 3 million people who sent in comments, which is an extraordinary amount of people to comment on anything, to a government agency. But the other is, on some level, we were also sort of almost at a football game where it was one massive element of an industry versus another distinct massive, industry fighting it out. And sadly, much of the stuff that we're going to see, or we're going to have to be like relying on to slow Trump's roll, is going to be watching like one set of moneyed interests fighting another set of moneyed interests when their interests don't necessarily align. And that's usually, sort of like, broadly speaking, at 30,000 feet, their interests align, but sometimes how they enrich themselves doesn't align. And there's going to be times where we're going to find ourselves rooting for, it's going to be, Godzilla versus King Kong. And we're going to have to choose one of those to, in certain instances, neither of whom we might particularly like. I don't know enough of the lore of King Kong and Godzilla to
where does Mothra come in?
Or Mothra or any of that. But that's the dynamic that we're going to be looking at.
Well, yeah. And it's a failure that the Democrats didn't reject those tech bro freaks. Matt's kind of made this point. But during the Obama era, we're now at a point where they've built up enough.
Metastasized, yes.
They've built up enough money where these.
Turning on the host.
Yeah. And these Twitter or Meta, what does Meta make? Right? Those stupid
Remember
VR.
the VR thing without legs?
Which they're just toys for rich people, but they can't do more than that. Because they exist under capitalism, they're supposed to be constantly creating endless growth for their shareholders, and they've reached a saturation point in terms of selling people's data.
And here comes China.
So how do they maintain that? Now they're Republicans, and you have Mark Zuckerberg, who was sucking up to what's his name in the House, Jim Jordan, right before the election, saying, "Oh, you were right. We were biased in repressing that New York Post article about Hunter Biden's genitalia. We'll be on your side." And honestly, their gambit paid off. Jeff Bezos nixing the endorsement from the Washington Post editorial board of Kamala Harris was also designed to do this. They all the capital's all aligning here, and this is gonna be the first 2 years in particular, they're going to try to ransack the administrative state, and all of these corporations are going to take whatever they can get.
Yep.
So, and by the way, I want to see, is JD Vance going to stand up for the antitrust enforcement and all those kind words about Lena Khan that he was saying in the race?
I'm sure.
Is he going to make sure that they keep on Lena Khan and make sure that they don't encumber her from doing her job at the FTC? I'm skeptical.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.